Cheryl Wademan is walking a beach near Euclid on the last day of 2007. At the raw edge of the country, where Western Australia ends, South Australia begins. It's one of the most remote coastlines imaginable. The Nullarbor Plain presses down from the north, and the Southern Ocean runs unbroken to Antarctica in the south. There's almost nobody out here, and Cheryl's not looking for anything in particular. She's just walking. It's the kind of stroll you take along a beach when you want your mind to just stop. When you want the sound of the waves and the vastness of the ocean to absorb all thought. And she's doing such a good job of it that she almost steps over the bottle. It's half buried in the sand at the tide line, glass darkened by years in the water, the label long since gone. She picks it up and smiles to herself when she recognises the bottle by shape without the need for a label. Bacardi rum. She's been there before, more than once. She shakes it and something shifts inside. Cheryl struggles to work the cap loose, but when she finally does, she's pleased to find that the paper is dry, protected perfectly by the seal. The handwriting, she assumes, is a young man's. Loose, good-natured, written fast. Someone who wasn't composing, just scribbling. And what the message contains is a tongue-in-cheek offer of a free holiday in the Whitsundays, a couple of phone numbers, and then, at the bottom, 3 words and a name. See you soon. John. Cheryl reads the letter twice. She looks out across the ocean. What she doesn't know yet was that note was written 19 years ago. John was 23 years old when he dropped that bottle over the side of the vessel that he was sailing on, the Patanela. And sadly, he wouldn't see anyone soon. G'day. Welcome back to Struth. I'm your storyteller, Mark, and today we're out on the high seas. This episode is a request from Chris and Tanya, loyal listeners to the show. Thanks so much for reaching out and letting me know about this fascinating tale. John Blissett was 23 years old in October 1988. He was from Taree, a town on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. It sits on the Manning River a few kilometres from where it meets the Tasman Sea. He's fair-haired, solidly built, the kind of young man who looked entirely natural on a boat deck. His parents were Brian and Marge. His best mate was Michael Calvin, 21 years old, also from Taree, the son of Dawn Calvin and the twin brother of Sue. If John was the steadier of the two, Michael was the one with the gift of the gab. He could always be relied upon for a good yarn, and these two young men set themselves for a life full of exciting stories. They had met working on the water and discovered they wanted the same thing out of life: their own charter business, their own vessel on the Whitsunday Islands in far north Queensland. Blue water, white sails, paying passengers, and nobody telling them what to do. It was not an unusual dream for two young men who had grown up within earshot of the ocean. But this was more than the type of talk blokes do over a few beers on a Friday night. John and Michael were working seriously toward it. They had already crewed together on a Whitsundays charter schooner called the Golden Plover, accumulating the sea hours they needed toward their maritime certificates. Michael had also, perhaps a little prophetically, worked as a set rigger on the filming of a Philip Noyce thriller called Dead Calm. It's a story about a couple stranded on a yacht in the middle of the Pacific when a stranger climbs aboard. It was filmed partly off Airlie Beach, and it would be released in cinemas the following year. You'll be forgiven for finding that small detail perhaps a little uncomfortable in hindsight. In mid-1988, in Fremantle Harbour in Western Australia, they came across their golden opportunity. A man named Alan Nicol had recently bought a schooner. It wasn't a glamorous modern racing yacht, but something older, a little more subdued. It was a 63-foot working vessel with twin masts and a steel hull that had already survived things that would have sunk a lesser boat. Nicol, you see, had plans to run her as a tourist charter in the Whitsundays. But first, she had to get there. He needed a delivery crew to bring her from Fremantle to Airlie Beach, roughly 5,000 kilometres away via the bottom of the continent and up the east coast. John and Michael presented themselves on the dock and asked for the job. They said they'd even work for nothing if Nicol would let them use the vessel for their charter business once it arrived. Nicol agreed. He said their names would go on the paperwork. Neither of them even bothered to think it over. This was it. It was time for the adventure of a lifetime. Michael wrote his twin sister Sue a letter as the coast of Western Australia disappeared behind them. He described clear skies, a full moon, good wind. He sounded like a man who could not believe his luck. The schooner's name was Patanela. And if you're a superstitious person, as most old salts are, you might want to know that some people believe the name meant devil. The Patanela had been built in Tasmania in the mid-1950s. She was reputedly the first steel-hulled yacht ever constructed in the state. Hand-welded, 63 feet long, 45 tonnes displacement, with 3 watertight bulkheads running the length of her belly. Her masts were tall, her square portholes were distinctive. And by 1988 she had a yellow hull and wheelhouse. And inside she carried colour radar, satellite navigation and a 48-hour emergency position indicating beacon, what sailors call an EPIRB. In the event of a catastrophe, the beacon would float free of the sinking hull and broadcast a distress signal to the satellites above. The call sign on her radio was Victor Mike Papa Tango. If you don't understand any of that jargon, just know that it all adds up to the Patanela being built for the worst conditions. And by 1988, she'd already proven herself nearly indestructible. In fact, she'd developed quite the reputation for it. In 1958, working as a rock lobster boat in Bass Strait under the Hunt brothers of Strahan, the Patanela struck a submerged rock off Tasmania's northwest coast and tore a hole in her hull roughly 1.5 metres wide. A hole that should have taken her straight to the bottom, but the watertight bulkheads held. She sailed approximately 200 kilometres back to port in calm seas over about 14 hours, with the Southern Ocean pressing in at her wound the whole way. The Hunts pulled her from the water, repaired her, and sent the Patanela back out to work. The story of that voyage spread in the way that maritime stories often do, passed from berth to berth, port to port, until it became part of the vessel's identity. The Patanela did not sink. The Patanela could not sink. That was simply understood. And it was why, in 1964, an expedition chose her to carry a climbing party to one of the most hostile places on Earth. Major Warwick Deacock was the founder of the Australian Outward Bound School and the man who brought the Duke of Edinburgh Awards to Australia. He was also quietly fearless. He'd organised an expedition to Heard Island, a sub-Antarctic volcanic mass roughly 4,100 kilometres southwest of Perth, midway between Australia and Antarctica, ringed by glaciers and permanent storm systems, and about as difficult to reach as anywhere on the planet. The vessel he chartered for the voyage was the Patanela. The skipper of the expedition was 66-year-old British mountaineer Bill Tillman. Tillman was legendary. A man who had attempted Everest in the 1930s and spent the decades since sailing converted working vessels into the polar regions as though discomfort were its own reward. He had brought his own boat, Mischief, on previous expeditions, but he chose the Patanela this time over her because of the hull, because she didn't sink. And so in January 1965, 5 men, Deacock, Graham Budd, Colin Putt, John Crick and Philip Temple, stood on the summit of Heard Island's Big Ben, a volcano rising nearly 2,800 metres straight from the Southern Ocean, Australia's highest mountain. It was the first time anyone had climbed it. The Patanela waded in the black water below, and she brought them all home, safe and sound. By 1988, she'd changed hands several times and sailed further distances than most vessels ever see. Joining the 2 young men on their journey was the captain, Kenneth Jones. Ken was 52 years old, from Perth, a commercial pilot, a blue water sailor with thousands of miles and at least one Admiral's Cup campaign behind him. People who knew Ken described him as meticulous, capable, someone you wanted in the captain's chair when conditions turned bad. His wife, Noreen, 50 years old, and their daughter, Ronalee, were also sailing aboard the Patanela. Ronalee had joined the departure from Fremantle and would ride along as far as Port Lincoln on the Eyre Peninsula before returning home for work she couldn't postpone. Alan Nicol, the owner of the vessel, was also on board for the first part of the trip. He would later depart the vessel at Esperance on the south coast of Western Australia after being called back to Perth by business he couldn't defer. He planned to rejoin the yacht in Sydney, bring his family aboard and complete the voyage up the coast to the Whitsundays. And so, on the 16th of October, 1988, the Patanela cleared Fremantle Harbour. 6 people were aboard, the Southern Ocean ahead, the Whitsundays waiting at the other end, cocktail in hand. The early part of the voyage was unremarkable. South across the Great Australian Bight, the consistent swells, the kind of sea time that creates its own rhythm. On the 26th of October, somewhere in the middle of the Great Australian Bight, John Blissett wrote his message. He rolled it into a Bacardi bottle, sealed it, and dropped it over the side. The full letter read as follows.
Hi there, out here in the lonely Southern Ocean and thought we would give away a free holiday in the Whitsunday Islands in North Queensland, Australia. Our ship is travelling from Fremantle, Western Australia, to Queensland to work as a charter vessel. See you soon. John.
He signed off with 2 phone numbers. It was a message that told you everything about where his head was at the time. Already on the Whitsundays, eagerly awaiting the future. It was about this time in the trip that the small oddities began. From Portland in Victoria, Ken Jones telephoned Alan Nicol and asked for $500. He said it was for fuel. Nicol wired him the money. But multiple people who later examined the voyage logs and the fuel records told investigators that the tanks had been full at Fremantle and had been topped up at subsequent stops along the way. The $500, if spent, left no trace of what it was spent on. and an experienced sailor of Jones's calibre, people noted, would have known to the litre exactly how much fuel he had. Another important detail to note at this stage of the journey is that Jones was motoring more than he was sailing. This wasn't because conditions demanded it. In fact, the weather on this leg of the voyage was, by all accounts, reasonable sailing weather. But he was frequently motoring, burning diesel unnecessarily. On the 5th of November, Michael Calvin managed to call his father in Taree. The call connected. Calvin said, "G'day, Dad," and then the line went dead. Michael didn't call back. His father tried to reach the vessel for days after, but there was no response. On the 7th of November, the Patanela was spotted from the shore near Jervis Bay on the New South Wales south coast. She was motoring north. Eyewitnesses placed her at about 80 kilometres south of Sydney. Then things begin to get truly strange. At 11 minutes to 1 in the morning of the 8th of November 1988, Keith McLennan was the operator on duty at Sydney Radio, the Overseas Telecommunications Commission's marine radio service on the New South Wales coast. He was working the overnight shift. It was a quiet night. The Patanela came up on Channel 6. It was Ken Jones's voice. He sounded, McLennan later told the Coronial Inquest, calm, unhurried, as though he were calling to check in rather than to report a problem. He gave his position as approximately 10 nautical miles east of Botany Bay, and then he said, "I believe we've run out of fuel. We've hoisted our sails and we're tacking out to the east, so tracking about 080. Intention is to tack out for a couple of hours and then tack back in. We may need some assistance in the morning to get back into Sydney Harbour." McLennan took note of the position. He told Jones he would keep an eye on the weather for him. And the call ended. Let's stop to consider that transmission for just a moment. 10 miles east of Botany Bay, one of the busiest maritime approaches in Australia. An experienced ocean sailor who has just rounded the entire bottom of the continent and navigated the length of the New South Wales coast, describing his precise position to the nearest navigation chart, telling Sydney Radio he believes he's run out of fuel. Not that he has run out, that he believes he has run out. A man who, by all accounts, had been motoring for days and had recently requested and received $500 specifically for fuel. Just over an hour later, at 1 minute to 2 in the morning, Jones called again. He asked McLennan for a weather forecast. McLennan supplied one and warned that winds would be strengthening. Then Jones asked something that made no navigational sense at all. He asked for directions to Moruya. Moruya, you see, is a town on the New South Wales coast. It sits roughly 300 kilometres south of Sydney, meaning Jones had passed Moruya hours earlier on his way north. He'd been travelling north for days. The Whitsundays were north, Sydney was north, and Moruya was far behind him in the wrong direction. And remember, he knew he was 10 miles east of Botany Bay when he called just over an hour ago. He wasn't mistaken. McLennan gave him the information. He would later say again that during this call, Jones's voice gave him no cause for alarm. A little after 2 o'clock in the morning, the radio crackled again. The third call was fragmented, broken by static. McLennan could make out Jones's voice, but only pieces of what he was saying. The words that came through clearly were 300 kilometres south, and then, is it? South? Then nothing. Keith McLennan waited. He called the call sign back. Victor Mike Papa Tango. Victor Mike Papa Tango. No answer. He called again and again, but nothing. The Patanela was gone. There was no mayday, no distress call. The EPIRB, the emergency beacon designed to float free of a sinking vessel and broadcast automatically, never triggered. It wasn't triggered by water immersion, and it wasn't triggered manually. The weather that night was overcast with a light northeasterly and a moderate swell, but it wasn't a dangerous night. It was not the sort of night that should have killed anyone. No oil slick appeared on the water the next morning, no debris field, no life raft, no cushions, no clothing, no fuel containers, nothing from the interior of the vessel drifted ashore. And remember, the vicious Southern Ocean, years before, had taken the Patanela apart in storms that should have sunk her, and she still made her way home without fuss. But now, a calm November night 10 miles off Botany Bay had left no mark at all. Maritime authorities checked every vessel recorded in the approaches to Botany Bay in the early hours of the 8th of November. They checked 48 ships. Not one showed damage consistent with the collision. The closest candidate was a 43,000-tonne bulk carrier. Her crew denied any impact. Her log showed nothing. An inspection revealed nothing. Alan Nichol, who had departed in Esperance earlier in the voyage, arrived in Sydney on the 18th of November to find no yacht waiting and no message explaining why. And so the families raised the alarm. By then, if the Patanela had sunk near Botany Bay, whatever surface evidence she'd left had been drifting for 10 days in currents that could have carried it anywhere. The search that followed was widely regarded as too little, too late. May 1989. 6 months since the Patanela's last radio call. A fisherman is working the waters off Terrigal on the New South Wales Central Coast. It's about 80 kilometres north of Sydney. When something comes up in the gear that isn't a fish, he pulls it in without much thought. It's amazing what you drag up out here. On this occasion, it's a lifebuoy. White, or at least it was once white. The item is now furred so thickly with barnacle growth that it's almost unrecognisable. He sets it on the deck and starts to scrape off the barnacles with an old paint scraper. And then he stops. There are letters underneath. Not all of them are clear, but enough that he can make out a name. A name that everyone working on the water in New South Wales is now intimately familiar with. The name of a boat that has been spoken about for months, in every pub, in every portside town. Patanela, Fremantle. He hands it in to authorities, well aware of the importance of his find. Barnacles are patient colonisers. Given the right surface, the hull of a vessel, the underside of a pontoon, the casing of a lifebuoy, they'll establish themselves within days of immersion and build their calcium shells steadily outward from there. A marine biologist that knows what they're looking at can take a sample of barnacle growth and read it the way a forester reads a ring in a trunk. Not precisely, but close enough. And it was one such marine biologist that examined the barnacle growth that remained on this buoy. What the fisherman had left behind in those few minutes on the deck before he understood what he was holding. It was a compromised sample, partial, and the biologist was careful about what could be claimed from it. But the estimate, offered with appropriate caution, was this. The growth was consistent with approximately 4 weeks in the water. Not 6 months, not since November, just 4 weeks. If that estimate is right, and again, it was an estimate, then in April of 1989, 5 months after Keith McLennan's radio went silent, the lifebuoy, at least, was still on the surface. Or perhaps, even more inexplicably, some part of the Patanela was still on the surface of the water. The Australian Federal Police opened a formal investigation in February of 1989. They called it Operation Lilac, and it ran for years. In 1992, Deputy State Coroner Derrick convened a formal inquest in Sydney and heard 4 days of evidence. From Keith McLennan, the Overseas Telecommunications Commission operator who was the last known person to speak to the vessel, from the owner, Nickel, from the families, and from maritime experts. Derrick reached an open finding. He stated, on the record, that he was satisfied the yacht had sunk and all aboard had died, most likely as the result of a collision with a much larger vessel, whose crew either did not notice the impact or chose not to report it. He could not reconcile that conclusion with the missing debris, the silent beacon, the strange radio calls, or the lifebuoy that arrived too late. He said so, and therefore left the finding open. No charges were ever laid, no bodies were ever recovered, no civil proceedings, no insurance disputes. Nothing further has reached public record. In the years since, 4 broad explanations have been proposed, each one answering some of the questions, but none of them answering all of them. The first is the coroner's conclusion, a collision. A large vessel strikes the Patanela in the dark. It either doesn't see her or doesn't stop. The schooner, taking on water, sinks quickly. But against this theory is the fact that the Patanela had survived 1.5 metres of hull breach in Bass Strait in 1958 and sailed 200 kilometres home. In calm water, a vessel with 3 watertight bulkheads does not typically vanish without trace. The EPIRB 2 should have floated free, regardless of how fast she went down. That's exactly what it was designed to do. And then, of course, there was the lifebuoy. The second theory is hijacking. Someone wanted the vessel, or wanted something from it, and the strange radio calls, the fuel story, the Maruya misdirection, the abrupt third call. In this version of events, they were the actions of a man operating under duress, feeding blatantly false information into the record before the radio was taken from him. Alan Nickel raised this possibility directly with Western Australian Police and added a further layer to this theory. He believed that he'd been cheated in the original purchase of the Patanela and that a former co-owner might have wanted her back. Operation Lilac investigated this angle and found no evidence sufficient to support it. There is also a drug trade variant of the hijacking theory, that the schooner was seized by smugglers to use as a coastal transfer vessel. This was circulated widely in the tabloid press of the time, grounded partly in the era's genuinely active drug trade along Australia's coastline, and grounded predominantly in nothing at all. Neither Ken Jones or Noreen Jones or John Blissett or Michael Calvin appears in any police or National Crime Authority intelligence file. Rumours about the young men in particular being part of this murky underworld were scoffed at by anyone and everyone that knew them. And why would people from the drug trade want such a distinctive boat? Why would they kill 4 people, making the boat virtually unusable, when they could far more easily steal a less distinctive boat from a boatyard on shore. The only part of the drug trade theory that made any sense was the fact that the vessel was lost this close to Sydney in the 1980s. The third explanation emerged in a 2023 television documentary when a retired submarine commander named John Dickenberg put forward the possibility that Ken Jones, under the weight of a financial collapse he had hidden from almost everyone, chose to end his own life and took the people aboard with him. It has been proven that Jones's own boat was being repossessed. His business was failing, and he was a proud, capable man watching the things he had built dissolve. The calm voice in the radio calls, Dickenberg suggested, was not a man in fear. It was a man who had already decided. However, countering this, Jones's son Peter has always maintained a different reading, that the transcript of those calls is the sound of his father trying, obliquely, to tell someone that something was wrong. Depending on how you look at those three radio calls, both of those perspectives are clearly visible, and that's the nature of this case. And now, one more thing. It's never been widely reported because the man who saw it kept it to himself for 30 years. Ted McCarthy is a retired New South Wales police officer. In March of 1989, 4 months after the Patanela's disappearance, he was out on the water when he saw a schooner at anchor. He looked at her through binoculars. Square portholes, distinctive wheelhouse placement, the same plaited rope bowsprit he recognised from a photograph in the magazine. He compared the vessel directly to the photograph, and he was certain. He was also inherently suspicious. He called across to her on the radio. A voice answered. The voice told him clearly and without hesitation that she was not the Patanela. She weighed anchor that evening and set sail. McCarthy watched her go. He told almost no one. He carried it quietly for more than 3 decades before finally telling his story on camera in 2023. If McCarthy was right, the Patanela was afloat for 4 months at least after she was supposed to have sunk. The lifebuoy's barnacle evidence points to perhaps the same window. 2 separate pieces of evidence, neither of them definitive, both suggesting the same impossible thing. Maybe she sunk after the sighting, somewhere really remote where no one could have noticed, and that's how the lifebuoy managed to float free. Or maybe after the sighting someone decided they needed to get rid of any evidence with the word Patanela on it and turfed the lifebuoy off the side of the boat. In this version of events, the sea off Botany Bay was indeed empty on the morning of the 8th of November 1988. The Patanela had, in a different sort of way, disappeared. But somewhere else, a schooner with a yellow hull and square portholes was sailing under a different name. The bottle that Cheryl Waderman found on Euclid Beach in New Year's Eve 2007 was posted to the Blissett family in Taree. Cheryl had traced the phone numbers. Marge Blissett held the paper her son had touched 19 years before, somewhere in the middle of the bight, in high spirits, writing a cheerful note to no one in particular and dropping it into a bottle on the off chance the sea would carry it somewhere interesting. A marine biologist estimated that the note had drifted over 2,000 kilometres before it made landfall. The bottle had taken 19 years to travel from the bight to the WA-SA border. The currents had been patient. Marge Blissett told the Sydney Morning Herald what the bottle meant to her family. It supports our belief that the boys were there for no other reason than adventure, she said. What happened to them on a calm night 10 miles off Botany Bay remains, 37 years later, without a confirmed answer. The Patanela was the ship that couldn't sink. Built by hand in Tasmania, trusted with an Antarctic expedition sailed to the base of Australia's highest mountain and back. She'd survived a busted hole in Bass Strait, a Southern Ocean winter, and decades of working the sea. And yet, she vanished within sight of Sydney Harbour on a mild spring night, leaving behind one lifebuoy, 3 radio calls that don't add up, and a bottle that took 19 years to find the shore. And if you stand on a beach on the southeast coast of Australia, late at night, and watch the container ships moving north through the dark, their navigation lights steady, their wakes dissolving, you might find yourself wondering whether, somewhere further out, past the shipping lanes, there's a yellow-hulled schooner with square portholes, running without lights, under a name no one would recognise. Stranger things have happened out on these waters. Struth. Thanks again for listening to Struth. This episode, as I mentioned, was a request from Chris and Tanya. Thanks so much for reaching out and suggesting this fascinating tale. And another reminder, if you want to hear more stories like this one, you can support the show through Patreon. Subscribers receive early episodes, bonus content, ad-free listening. The links are in the show notes. And a huge thank you to all of you who have commented on the episodes, given us a like and shared their love of Struth with friends. It does make a massive difference to an independently produced podcast, and every little bit of support helps me to tell more of these tales. So from me, in my shed in Tasmania, many thanks. Next week, we analyse a true crime case from Goodna that has just been reopened by Queensland Police. It's a doozy. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you then.